Now that we've talked about timelines and you've read through the materials on tools and measuring, let's talk a little bit more about monitoring and evaluation, because this is basically developing and maintaining your plan. One other thing I want to backtrack on just a little bit is tool options. You need to remember that yes, we do the usual, the ads, the press releases, the brochures, the flyers, but also marketing tools such as ink pens, toys, coffee cups, clocks, notepads, anything that can hold the organization's brand. Just make sure that it fits not only with the campaign, but it also fits with the budget. Non-physical items such as slogan and word-of-mouth messages are tools that we use just to keep things top of mind, and traditional items such as building relationships, guest editorials, editorial board conferences, and events. All of these are things that we use that are considered tools. None of these are objectives. All of these are under objectives and part of tools. Whatever it is that you use, make sure that it makes sense for the campaign and that it is all about and for the client. Remember, client must remain top of mind. So once your plans are made, once your tools are decided, then we begin talking about some other issues, such as determining how the plan will be monitored and evaluated. Now, what will be used as the campaign progresses to make sure it stays on track? Best thing to do is to look at the objectives. Keep the objectives in mind as a way of monitoring. At the end of the campaign, you use the same measurement to help evaluate its success or failure, along with some other elements. Once that you get to the end of the campaign, we do a comprehensive final evaluation. What worked, what didn't work. For this, we call it the post-mortem. And in this, and this is just a final measurement, going back and making sure that everything worked the way we hoped it did. And it is a medical term, but it's one that's used universally throughout the industry. So in this final evaluation, you look at everything. You look at what went right, what went wrong, what went up right, what went sideways, and why. And you have to be very, very honest with yourself in doing this and make sure that you're giving the proper information. Never make excuses, because that's just wrong. How are you going to learn? How are people going to decide whether or not they're going to repeat this later on if there are excuses, if the information isn't correct? So look at everything carefully and be very upfront. Avoid the temptation to throw off bad results. A true professional faces those bad results, looks at them carefully, figures out how they happened, why they happened, and how to prevent them in the future. And then always we have to acknowledge that mistakes are made. I mean, we're human. We're always going to have errors that crop up. So this is just something that we have to acknowledge as we go along. Don't lay blame, just admit that in fact errors were made. Once we get to the post-mortem, some of the things that we need to think about, some of the things we need to work on is how not to evaluate. Now, frequently what we see is people will pick certain things to look at in evaluation, and these get you in trouble. Judgmental assessments. Judgmental assessments are basically your gut saying, hey, this worked well. That's not a great way of evaluating, because your gut may be saying, hey, this worked well. Somebody else on the team may say, this sucks. So you really need to find a better way other than just trusting, hey, this is how I feel about it. Always have a measure. Outputs evaluation. Outputs evaluation is something that a lot of people like to use, but the problem with it is that it's not quantifiable. Even though it sounds like it isn't. And this is something that, basically it's a non sequitur in this business. We see people using it and we need to stop them from doing that, because it's really not a good way of measuring what happened. Message cost. How much did it cost to get the message out? Okay, here's a problem when you do that. Your ad may be very inexpensive. you may be running it on KLEW at 5 a.m., but is it indeed reaching your target demographic? Not everything has to be Super Bowl worthy, but you have to find ways that effectively reach your audience. And if you're buying an ad cheap just because it's cheap, then it's not going to get you anywhere. So you need to pay attention to message cost. Advertising equivalency, this one is a big bugaboo and a lot of people use it. It's basically saying that the ad is exactly the same cost as news columns. Here's the problem. News is considered more trustworthy than ads, so people trust it more. So you're actually mixing apples and tangerines here, that these two things don't really equate. So you need to make sure that, if somebody says, oh, just, add up the column inches of how much was published and figure out how much that would be in advertising space, that's really a non sequitur. That's a non-starter. They don't compute together, and you need to recognize that. So how do you do a quality evaluation? Well, how to measure. There's several things that you can do. You calculate the message exposure through a number of things. Now, this is in addition to making sure that you met all your objectives. You can do this through a number of feedback methods. One is clipping services. Every state and some large cities have clipping services where you can get feedback from where were the stories printed. Anytime your name is mentioned, you pay a monthly fee and they will send you clips of all the news stories that talk about your organization. You can use media impressions. How many times was the story run? And that is a fairly good, just shows, especially when you look at where it was run, tells you whether or not you actually hit your target demographic. You can do readability surveys. Do people instantly recognize what you're talking about? Do they realize that this was part of the campaign? Does it come from your company, or do they think it comes from somebody else? So readability surveys are always good. Post-campaign surveys work really, really well, especially if you have a pre-campaign survey. And this allows you to benchmark, and I'll mention benchmark again in a minute, but this allows you to benchmark and show exactly how much of the needle of public opinion was moved. Very good thing to do, also really, really expensive. You can do message recall surveys. You can just ask people, if like you're in the mall at Christmas and somebody says, would you mind answering some questions? And then they say, if I say I'm loving it, what do you instantly think of? And people will, of course, say McDonald's. So, it's the message recall. Can people remember what your message was through a quick poll or a survey? And finally, there's the audience feedback. That is basically the audience contacting you and saying, I agree with this or I disagree with this. And they will reach out through phone calls, through email, through social media. If you are not following hashtags, set up your dashboard so that you can capture all those hashtags that people use. This is a way that people give you feedback. Are they using your hashtag in a positive way, or are they making fun of it? By being able to collect, you'll be able to see. And then this is the final, the benchmark studies. Benchmark studies, again, surveys, serious surveys that where we ask in-depth questions about how people feel about all of the issues within our campaign. So this is how to measure, and these are things that must carefully be considered for every single campaign.